Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you, Ken? How are you doing?
I'm exceptionally well, Rory. You find me from a different studio location today. We've moved home, so this is my new studio. Hopefully the sound is coming through good and strong as it normally does. Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is episode 225. 3 topics today, starting off with our Counselling Foundations, where we revisit that underpins good counselling practice. And today, a bit of theory as we delve into the configurations of self. Oh, it's an exciting one, that. Moving on to practice matters, first we're going to stop off at focus on self, Rory, because we recognize that we ourselves, with the heartbeat of our practice, we need to be okay to be there in service of our clients. And today we speak about continuing professional development, but a professional side of that, a qualification, that next step, you might say, and that is, are you ready to become a clinical supervisor, a counselling supervisor? So we'll be delving into that, and then into practice matters. And the reason I kind of maybe stumbled into practice matters a little prematurely there, Rory, is because I'm really excited of what practice matters holds today. And I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag. I am going to say we have a guest. I am going to say his name is Wayne Lawrence, but you are going to wait and stick around, and believe me, it will be well worth the wait, because the topic is extremely interesting. So that to look forward to. There's the hook, Rory. There's the hook. Stay tuned, as they say in broadcasting. But we start off while we visit those Counselling Foundations with that bit of theory called configurations of self. First of all, Rory, what is configurations of self?
Well, I think it could be categorized as the many voices inside the one. Of course, we're talking about the work of Dave Mearns, a large and influential voice in the world of person-centered counselling. And configurations of self is a development of person-centered therapy. It builds on the work of John Rowan and subpersonalities, and can trace its roots really back to Mikhail Beltin and William James, talking about the I and the me. So configurations of self is where you have different voices in you. Now, I'm not talking about psychotic voices in your head. I'm talking about emotional voices. So have a think about this if you're listening. Have you ever had a day when you have a bit of an angry voice in you, or you have a bit of a sad voice, or you have a really excited voice? Perhaps it's a birthday or a celebration. Those voices that we have form a little group of personalities, like a little tribe within our emotional system. And as such, at any given time, we can be kind of taken over by those voices. I'm sure that we've all been excited about doing something really, really exciting, and it becomes all encompassing. And sometimes in the therapy room, Ken, clients come and they have voices that are frightened voices, that are scared voices, that are voices of anger or voices of regret. And we always try to meet the client where they are. So recognizing the voice, the tone, the nonverbal communication allows us to meet the client where they are and be closer to their frame of reference.
Oh, I like it. I think that is beautifully described of what is configurations of self. And I recognize, as you're speaking about those voices, that you can have more than one voice speaking at a time. So you may have the excited, let's go for the excited voice. You may have the excited voice that is all excited, and like you say, it can be all encompassing. But then there might be another voice that comes in and go, come on, you mustn't get too excited about this. And you've almost got two voices. And we often see this presented in the therapy room, where a client may present with something and share how they're going on, and then they may come in with another voice almost immediately saying, but you know what, I've just got to get on with it, I can't be feeling like this, I shouldn't be feeling like this, I shouldn't be wallowing in that. And you've got these two different voices. And when I picked up on this theory for the first time, which was during my studies under you, Rory, I'm glad to say, I really found it really interesting, because I was unaware of it. I guess it was outside my awareness, these different voices, until I started looking. And when you look to self, you can start identifying the voices. And what's a lot of fun is giving them names and little personalities. So I've got one that I'm going to share with you now, who's a judge. And it's a judge that kind of wiggles its finger at me and tells me what I could have done, what I should have done, what I should do, how I should have handled that, how I should handle what's coming up. It's always judging. And it's I recognize this voice when it comes up now. But what I do to kind of take the power out of it is I put a little judge's wig on it. So in the United Kingdom courts, the horsehair wigs are worn. So I put a big wig on it, and it makes it more recognizable, because I think when the voices come, they can be out of awareness, and we're taken by that voice or that inside personality or by that part of ourselves, and we identify that is us. But by giving it a name and a personality, recognize it when it comes, we can go, aha, I see you, there you are with your big wig on it. At least we have an awareness around that, and we don't have to fully identify or submerge ourselves into believing that is the whole of us, because it can seem like it's the whole of us at the time when it's the voice that is the loudest, Rory.
Absolutely, Ken. And you've said something quite significant there. You've said out of awareness. And those who come from the person-centered canon, the lexicon of work of people like Carl Rogers, would say, well, don't we work on the edge of awareness? And here's the thing, the work of John Rowan, the work of Dave Mearns, gets us closer to our friends in the psychoanalytical world. And when you talk about voices, of course, we've talked on the podcast about parent, adult, and child, the TA voice. Yeah. But actually, we're not far away, and it's where psychoanalytical theory and humanistic theory actually bump together. In fact, some may say slightly overlap. And that's why it's such an exciting theory, because it brings to awareness those voices in us. And I'm going to share with you a fun fact. If you want to conceptualize what this looks like, for those of you who are Trekkers, who watch Star Trek, have a think about this. There's Ken. If you can't see this on the podcast, but on the video, Ken's doing his live long and prosper sign for the video. For
the Vulcans.
Yes, that's it. And if you think of the Starship Enterprise as a person boldly going where no one has gone before, in other words, moving through life, seeing and experiencing really different things as we do through the arc of our lives. And if you think of the crew as the configurations of self, so you have Commander Worf, and he's the warrior, he wants to fight everybody, and then you have Commander Riker, and he's the Romeo, and he likes to do the romance thing, and then you've got Diana Troy, she's the counselor, so she's like the wisdom, and then you've got Jean-Luc Picard, and he's the kind of person who does the thinking. And of course, you've got Commander Data, an android who is searching for humanity, a very existential position. And if you think of it like that, that actually fits very well the configurations of self. And another little fun fact, Gene Roddenberry, who was the founder of Star Trek, was in fact a humanist and was part of the human potential movement. A little fun link there to Carl Rogers. So it's configurations of self. And I'll give you a little challenge. If you want to find your configurations, get yourself a piece of paper, draw a circle on it, and then draw the voices that sometimes drive you. I identified mine many years ago. I have the thinker, the peacemaker, and one that's hidden in a room and that doesn't come out anymore, and that's the assassin. And every time I get mad with people, this person runs out, and the peacemaker and the thinker kind of bundle the assassin back to his room and lock the door again. But it's really interesting, and I think it's something that should be taught in all courses, because it gives, as Ken said, an unknown aspect to you that brings into awareness. A fantastic piece of theory.
I like that. And as you were describing those configurations of yourself that you've identified, Rory, I recognize when you're speaking about that assassin jumping out, somebody cuts you off in traffic. I bet the door of the assassin's room opens up, and then you have the thinker and the peacemaker actually, and there's the other voices, and that's the concept of we have more than one voice saying to the assassin, no, it's okay, back in your room. You can hear the door closing as peace is once again restored. And again, I mean, this is about, first of all, looking to ourselves and our own personal development, but also we may see this presenting in therapy. We may see our clients demonstrating the different voices within. They may show the anger if they're speaking about a certain person. And it's interesting, Rory, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but there is some thinking on my side about speaking to the voice that is present at the time, but recognizing and acknowledging that is not the whole of the person. So I'm thinking now of working with those configurations. So you may have a person who presents and they're all gentle and soft, and then they may find an angry voice about a certain part of their life. How would you kind of deal with that? And I don't want to go into giving any advice of how people should practice, because that's not what this is about. We're here to talk about the topic and get you thinking about it. But I think that's an interesting part of this topic.
You're absolutely right. And Dave Mearns talked a lot, and there's a lot of transcripts in his book about meeting clients within those configurations. And I think it speaks to relational depth, and I think it speaks to idiosyncratic empathy, where you're listening so intently, you can see the shift into that subpersonality, and that person speaks maybe from a frightened place. Yeah. And you adapt yourself to speak to that frightened person, almost like you'd be speaking to a community of people, and each person would be unique within the room. And it's true to say that each person's unique within the person. So yes, we're not teaching people how to practice, but with very intense listening, you can see the shift and be able to speak directly to that subpersonality, so that person feels heard. Even my assassin needs to feel heard, Ken.
Yes. And it goes into that Carl Rogers quote where he speaks about that acceptance, of how acceptance is the most important of all. And when I truly accept myself as I am, and recognizing and accepting those different parts of self, those different configurations. And it's interesting as we kind of back out of this topic, Rory, you came into this speaking about it being maybe a development in person-centered therapy and how that's built on. We spoke about edge of awareness and out of awareness, and how within the purest of person-centered, we only stay on the boundaries of maybe that awareness. But it's interesting now when we look at transactional analysis, and if we look at transference, within transactional analysis, you will speak to the transference and work with the transference, almost like we're talking here about working with the voice. And it's so interesting that when you kind of take that 3,000-foot view of all the different theories, they seem to kind of have similarities with different names, but similarities. And it's just interesting to watch how person-centered, the person-centered model has developed and grown and been built out over the years. Oh, lovely topic. Thank you for bringing it, Rory.
Well, it's a pleasure. And as I say, if you're listening out there in podcast land, have a think about your subpersonalities, write them down. And it's a great opportunity, as a final thought, it's a great opportunity to be able to strengthen the more positive personalities within you. So my thinker and my peacemaker are now incredibly strong, and my assassin spends all of his time sat in the room. He doesn't come out, which means I don't get angry very often, and which is a good thing. I can think or philosophicalize, if that's even the word. I think I've invented it this morning, my way out of situations and become more of a balanced individual. So it speaks also to personal development.
Thank you. So there it is. That is our Counselling Foundations, those configurations of self. We now move on to focus on self. So focus on self is where we recognize you are the beating heart of your practice. We need to be okay in order to be there for the people that we serve. And part of being okay is the development of ourselves, and the development of ourselves within our practice and within the service delivery side of our practice. And today, speaking about, are you ready to become a supervisor? Because becoming a supervisor has many facets. And I think, we go to supervision from practice day one. We're in supervision. And what it looks like as a therapist going into supervision and what it looks like from a supervisor's perspective looking out are quite different, Rory. And we teach supervision. We have a supervision course that we teach. And it's really interesting to hear how many people say, wow, it is so different to how I thought it might be. A lot of moving parts.
There is, Ken. And I'd like to start with this thought. I speak to a lot of therapists in my day-to-day interactions. And some I will say, you ever thought of becoming a supervisor? And they'll say, oh, I don't know what I can bring. And I say, you've got a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of practice experience, huge amounts of CPD. And that deserves to be developed in a way where you can help others, because as therapists, we're in service. Yes, I know we charge a fee and, we have to eat and, tea bags aren't cheap nowadays with the way the cost of living's gone up. But being able to take that wisdom, that practice experience, and help other therapists, in particularly student therapists, is a great thing. And people will say, and I was one of them, I'm not sure I've got enough experience to be a therapist. Until someone pointed out, as my supervisor said, you're a lecturer in counselling, you've been doing it 10 years. It's all you do. And you've had a diverse range of client bases. You should really be a supervisor. Which then speaks to the fact, as you say, Ken, that it's a very, very different discipline. It's a different job because you are overseeing or overlooking someone else's practice. And within that, you may have to be a little bit looking right and left, directive, Ken.
Yeah. Very much so. And then that is one of the elements specifically. Well, I mean, it depends on what your modality is. But if you are primarily trained in a person-centered modality, then you'd work in a non-directive way. As soon as you step into a supervision position, it is your job to be directive. It really is, because you're overseeing somebody's practice, multiple practices, and you're doing that in service of the clients that see those therapists. Mm-hmm. So yes, of course, we're serving the counsellor who will come to supervision, but the first duty of care of a supervisor is to the client, not to the therapist. Of course, working with the therapist in service of that client. And I think in terms of, if you're looking to yourself and saying, am I ready to become a supervisor within my own journey? The thing to consider is, to be a supervisor is incredible service. That's what it is. There's no what is it? There's no glory in, I'm on the next step of the ladder now. Now I am a supervisor. It is so service based. It really is. So if you have a heart for service, and so many of us are called into becoming therapists, counselors in the first place because we have a heart for service. If you have a really strong heart for service, then a supervisor would be a good fit for you, because you are 100% totally in service. And I think another consideration when looking at maybe training to become a supervisor is that the relationships are long-term. They can be very long-term. They can span multiple years, whereas within client contact, it may be, I'm not saying we don't have long-term clients, and we do, and depending on your modality, again, you may see clients for years and years. But very often we will see clients for a fixed number of sessions, but supervision will go on for many, many years. And that's quite a commitment when it comes to holidays and breaks and how your life plays out. And all of that needs to be taken into consideration, because it is a massive step into service.
Yes, absolutely. And I also think that a lot of people say, I don't want to be a supervisor because there's this issue of power. But the models that are taught, certainly in our course, are what's called non-deficit models. They're growth models. So when we supervise, and certainly in my supervision practice, I'm interested in helping develop therapists and develop their professional formation. I'm not particularly interested at all in kind of being like a line manager and doing that kind of telling people off maybe or kind of deficit work where you have to do this, you have to do that. It's a consultative environment, and certainly for students, a lot of students really, really appreciate the fact that they can sit with a practitioner and see how the theory is applied, and the supervisor can help them with that. So there's great service all around. And one final thing, I think when it comes to the job market, having a portfolio career where you've got different skill sets within counselling, and also employers now are looking for, I think, supervision qualifications. Certainly if you teach, they would look for a supervisor's qualification, I think.
Yes, I mean it's certainly going to be a tick on the CV, as you say, Rory. It's CV gold if you are looking
CV gold, yes.
CV gold if you are looking for employment, because it kind of shows I guess another level of study. And I wanted to just focus on the study element of this just for a moment. So one of the questions we often get asked is, how long does it take to train to become a supervisor? And the truth of the matter is, you're probably looking at putting a good year aside. Now, it's not to say that you're going to spend a year with a nose in a book or a year in the actual training itself, but the process from start to finish, including like the tutor-led sessions, the self-directed learning and the study that you need to do, and then the application of that in placement. If you give yourself a year, that I think is a realistic time frame. It can be done quicker. Some people do it much quicker indeed. Our tutor-led sessions with our training are delivered online. They're delivered over a full day, and that is from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. And we have 6 of those tutor-led sessions. And then we also have many hours of self-directed learning. So our tutor-led sessions in our training are very much experiential sessions where you will see the tutors being in supervision role. You'll get somebody being a client, somebody being a counsellor, somebody being a supervisor, and they will play out the mode or the theoretical part that you'll be learning that day. And then the day is really spent practicing that with peers. The self-directed learning are all the lectures that you might get in a college or university, and those are all housed within a learning environment. And then after the 6th session, which is about 12 weeks into training, that is when our supervisors go into placement. And then there's a placement hours that need to be done there. And ours is 20 supervised hours on our training. But it can take a year because you're only seeing somebody once a month. So if you've got one person, it's going to take you 20 months to get in those. If you're seeing 2, it's going to take you 10 months. If you're seeing 4, it's going to take you 5 months. So it's the maths on it. It does take longer than some people consider. And you do need to put away about 9 hours a week for the self-directed learning, for the book-read study, and for really processing what you are learning. So it's a huge commitment. It's not a little bit of CPD you do on the side. This is something you consider very, very carefully if you're going to train to be a supervisor, because it does take time.
Absolutely, Ken. And, one of the questions that we get asked so much, or one of the questions that is asked so much in our Facebook group, and if you're not a member of our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. We're a closed group, knock on the door, and our wonderful, loving moderation team will let you in. You can join thousands of like-minded people who talk about the world of counselling and psychotherapy, and our supervisors in there. And one of the questions that comes up is finding a supervisor. And here's the thing, finding a supervisor with online skills to be able to supervise somebody online. The pandemic has pushed counselling forward 10 years in time. It's like getting into a time machine and sending us forward 10 years. Telehealth, working online or on the phone, is now becoming a staple of a lot of organizations. And to supervise people who work online needs a specific skill set. And not to blow our own trumpet, but our qualification is actually a online and telephone supervisory qualification as well as a face-to-face qualification. But there are literally hundreds of posts in the Facebook group asking for supervisors.
Yeah.
And certainly in our online and telephone counselling Facebook page, which is a separate page for those who do our online and telephone counselling course, we always get people coming up and saying, can you tell us where I can get a supervisor who can supervise me for my online work? It's a growing edge. So that's all I'm going to say about that, really. But it's very, very popular. And I think you owe it to yourself. If you've got a lot of skill, if you've got a lot of passion, then why not share it with others? Why not be in service of others? And certainly our student colleagues, and help develop the profession in the way that it should be going.
Yeah. And when you're saying in the direction it should be going, Rory, I think it's prudent to point out that in September of 2021, the BACP, so if you're based in the UK, the BACP is one of our ethical bodies, not the only one, but it is an ethical body that republished their guidelines for supervisors working to best practice as a supervisor. And as part of that, they also updated the supervisor training curriculum. So this is a document from the BACP where they suggest what should be taught in a supervision training course. And they very clearly marked out specialist areas so that you'd have your base training to become a supervisor, which would give you face-to-face supervision skills. But then if you wanted to supervise online, it's a separate module that is added on there. And I think that's worth taking into consideration. I mean, if you are a qualified supervisor, maybe go and revisit your ethical body and have a look. Has there been any update? Because there's been so much update from the pandemic and from so many people going and working online. There's been so much of an update across many of the suggested how we should work, the guidelines of how we should work. And it's true, of course, in supervision as well. So there it is. As Rory was mentioning, the opportunities that lie now with so many people working online, and it's supply and demand at the end of the day. There is a deficit of supervisors that are trained to work with practitioners whose practice is online. And I'm thinking of one of our graduates is called Darren Hopgood, and I can say his name with confidence because I was speaking to him recently, and he was doing a bit of a testimonial for our training, and he was saying, Rory, that before his supervision training, he had one or two clients, and he was struggling within his practice, he's in private practice. Post his supervision training, he's now graduated and he's fully qualified. He's done his placement hours. He's now referring people onto other practitioners because it really does do that. It opens, as you say, Rory, your portfolio. It gives you another arrow for your bow. It really does. But it is a serious consideration. It is a massively serious commitment. It's a good year of your life. You're looking at about 9 hours per week of study and training. You need to have at least 2 years, and we would suggest more, at least a bare minimum of 2 years of practice. You need to have been out there. You need to be have been on that front line and gained the experience to be there in best service of others. Let's back out of that one. If you're interested in our training to become a supervisor, we're opening that training again in September 2022. If you're listening to this in real time, and you can join the wait list for that. That means we'll send you an invite to a webinar when we open up that training to tell you more about it, and you can get that information by going to our website, which is counsellingtutor.com. Into Practice Matters, where today, really, really exciting. Again, I'm still not letting the cat out of the bag because Wayne himself is going to tell you what is going on. But kind of give us a tiny little bit of a flavour, Rory. What have we got coming up?
Well, I met a wonderful man called Wayne Lawrence, and I I have so much admiration for this guy because he has, as I've termed it, he doesn't term it in this frame, a specialist counselling practice. And this is what he had to say about it.
Practice matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
And I'm delighted to welcome Wayne Lawrence, who's a practitioner who has a bit of a speciality. So, Wayne, thank you very much for joining us. And do you want to share what your speciality is?
Yes, hi, Rory, and everyone. Thanks for having me. Well, my speciality, as it's been placed, is that I'm a therapist that works in a prison, an all-men's prison at that.
Yeah, and the reason I would say it's a speciality is because I think there's a specific kind of set of training and things to be taken into account when working within a prison. So, first of all, let's start by asking, how long have you worked in a prison environment?
Thanks. I've actually been there coming this June, 2020, it will be 3 years.
Uh-huh.
So I was fortunate to be able to work, in this prison setting, because I've come from a background before even going down the route of becoming a therapist. I worked in health and social care for at least over 10 to 12 years. And so that's been in every area of health and social care, whether it's been care homes, whether it's, been like support work, working in the communities, lone working, adults, substance misuse, mental health, family interactions. It's been all of it. And so actually coming into the prison setting, it was a great inevitability in some ways as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And you talk about inevitability. So is that what drew you into working at a prison?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I'm actually a black male myself. And so one of the things that even drew me to therapy in itself was when I was working as a support worker, I felt limited in what I could support people with. So, I might help them with things pertaining to their homes, things to do with jobs or benefits. But what I noticed is I would sit with them and they would be conditioned to whatever happened around them, but nothing seemed to change within how they saw themselves in the mirror, right?
Yeah.
So it helped me to eventually look at, well, what could I do if I had this time with them that might help and support a person with themselves, with looking and being with themselves. So that was kind of one of the areas that took me down that route. And I also wanted to be able to do this from a point of view of giving men this opportunity to speak, to be able to communicate and hopefully, be honest about what it really means to be a man and what it means for them to be a man in terms of where they've come from or where they're going.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's answered the question of, what kind of motivated you to be a helper. You were saying that as a support worker, you could only do so much. It was more practical than emotional. And having been a support worker, I know you've got to be very, very careful not to cross the line into therapy. Exactly. Because it's not a contracted space, is it?
Exactly that. And I mean, when I was doing what I was doing as a lone worker and so on, what I'd noticed was the relationship, again, was one of those main fundamental important things, right? So I developed relationships with my clients. And so I noticed I was the focal point of them sharing when they were upset, when something wasn't going right. So they wouldn't even communicate this sometimes to their psychiatric nurse or to various other carers. They would do it with me. And so I think from even then, I noticed the importance of that one-to-one relationship and the rapport that was developed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and I think that's really important to state that, isn't it? That sometimes for people who've got a lot of difficulties going on in their life, sometimes having a single point of reliable contact of someone who's a stabilizing influence is really, really, really important, isn't it? Because sometimes there can be so much chaos going around people that it's hard to know who to go to.
Absolutely. Very true.
So, thinking about working in a prison environment, is there any specific training that you need to go through if you want to work in a prison?
It's such an interesting question, because for me personally, I think if I'm looking at it from a training point of view, what's helped me was the fact that I did do support work before. And what that means and how that looks is I am aware of joint agency working, right? I have an understanding of going onto computers and logging information, finding ways to communicate with other services and for them to communicate with me. That sense of working really did help me. But when we talk about training in regards to, being a specific type of therapist that could go into a prison, I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case, because the reality is when you eventually get into the space where it's yourself and the client, the functionalities are exactly the same, right? What I would say that, I think you do have to come to a certain sense of understanding is that it's not the same setting. So the general idea is in the prison, the prison is the law. So whereas even when we talk about, what am I thinking about? There's just certain areas that's the prime example. So if I was going to have a session and I sat down with a client and then something took place in the prison, if the prison officer comes to me and says, right, this has to be shut down, the client has to go back to their cell, it just has to happen. There's not a conversation of, but what about the client's needs? What about, do you see what I mean? In the prison, I am in some ways bound by the law of the prison, and I have to honor that because it's the functionality, again, of how the prison keeps people safe, including myself.
Yeah, and I've heard this from people who've worked in prisons, that sometimes there's a lockdown and everybody's literally locked in for a period of time, and that can be support staff and the inmates, and then eventually once that lockdown is complete, then free movement starts again. Yes, and I guess there's some laws that you wouldn't usually put in a contract if you weren't working outside a prison setting.
Exactly, and that's again what it is. It's being mindful, and you develop it over time. So even if people are sitting there thinking, I couldn't do that, believe it or not, it is something that with time you adjust, which again is one of the, especially if you've got certain models and approaches, it's about being person-centered. And so the idea that I've developed this understanding that, like you said, if there's a lockdown, one of the things I would still do is go to the cell door of my client and say, as you're aware, there's a lockdown, so we can't meet this week. We'll meet next week, or I may come back if I have a certain period of time and see you, when the lockdown is finished. So it's again about the approach you have to your clients, which is still person-centered. It's still being mindful of, the core conditions, but at the same time, and they recognize it as well. They honor the idea that they know, and actually most of the time, the preference for them is that I communicated that to them and didn't just leave them.
Yeah. And I think that there's an interesting dynamic there, isn't there? That you're not part of the prison establishment as such. You're
exactly
there. You're not wearing a prison officer's uniform. With great respect to any prison officer who may be listening to the podcast, but it's not the us and them situation that can sometimes play out.
That's right. Exactly that.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I've always wondered about, and prisons are a closed environment, and of course, at the end of a session, clients can get very, very, very upset. And, what happens usually is that people make their way home. They travel by public transport or car or however they get home. And they have time to, as I term it, decompress, to be able to bring themselves back in the real world. is rather trickier, I think, in a prison environment, isn't it? And we were talking in our little preamble before we recorded about, certain considerations that need to be thought about when someone's going back into what can be quite a tough environment.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually very important. And again, this is, like you mentioned before about learning, these are the things that I've learned to adapt and to internalize as being a therapist that works in a prison. And that is, I've worked and work with very vulnerable people who put on masks, basically, right? So whether it's from the fact that they've come from backgrounds where they've had to put on masks to show themselves tougher, more so they then come into this prison environment, and the vulnerable individual being vulnerable can be of great harm. And so at times I've even acknowledged that in a session. And so it's been like, someone's began to obviously become emotional, cry, be upset. Again, acknowledging what that feels for them, giving them the space to kind of process that and manage that. But also it's being congruent when it's about, I'm aware that now, we're coming to the end of the session and you're going to have to go back out into the wing. You're going to have to go back to your cell with another cellmate. And you don't want them to know that you've been crying. You don't want them to see that vulnerability. And so even at times, I've even sat with them and said, right, we're coming to an end. I'm going to give you some time just to readjust. And in a way, I've actually used the term. I've said, I understand that you may need to wear masks here to protect yourself. So this time you can now use to readjust, to put back on the mask, to go back out of this room. Because like you said, they don't have that ability to then come out of the door. I mean, in some of the wings, obviously, it's already really loud. It's already really chaotic. So in some ways, just giving them that little time to ground themselves before they go out, take that deep breath. It's effectively their decompressing?
Decompression, yeah, that's the term I use.
Decompression, it's that for them. Before they go out, and then they smile again, and I'm good, brother, and it's all good, and I'm just here for my my therapy, and knowing that they've been able for that period of time to be vulnerable. And again, it's a great practice because for some of them, they've never had that opportunity to even for half an hour to 50 minutes to be vulnerable. And so even them being able to do that, hopefully in some cases, it's something that they can then take with them and then learn to find outside of that room and that space, a place where they can be vulnerable and, where they can trust somebody, but then still, like most of us, still then have to put on the masks and, the exterior armor to go and deal with whatever we have to face. Yeah.
And it's almost like giving a permission, isn't it? What I'm hearing is that
exactly
you give them a permission to be something other than the tough guy personality that some people in prison may want to present to protect themselves. They can actually find that side of them that's vulnerable, and I guess that's where the change lies, isn't it?
Yeah, it's exactly that. I mean, I liken it to the fact that, in prison and being in a prison with mostly males, most of the way that they try to exercise out what they're feeling, what they're dealing with is through physical activity, right? Yeah. So it's all about the gym, it's about the lifting the weights, it's all about that. And again, I guess I can use the word that's beautiful about being a therapist in a men's prison is watching some of them come to the realization that it's not just about the physical gym, but the mental gym. And so now they're coming into the space where they're like, actually, I want to start finding the right exercises to manage how I deal with my emotions, and how I cope when certain things happen. And so it's, again, this great space that they do hopefully develop that and then obviously take it outside with them, even when they leave the actual prison. Yeah. And hopefully, create a new way of being for themselves.
Well, Wayne, it's been an absolute pleasure interviewing you. I think you've given us a peek inside a piece of practice that people don't often see, and maybe is a little underappreciated. I think that the ability to help people who are paying their price to society for the crimes they've committed can get not just the kind of punishment, but also some kind of, can kind of reclaim themselves and hopefully through therapy, be able, be able to make changes in their life and make positive changes. So, Wayne Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Wayne Lawrence. So needed, Rory. So needed. Really, really interesting. And I guess a glimpse behind the walls there that we don't often get to see. So thank you, Rory, for hosting that interview. And this has been the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 225.
Yes, we started off with Counselling Foundations, configurations of self and the many voices inside the one. And then we went on to focus on self. We talked at great depth about becoming a supervisor and why you might want to increase or enhance your professional formation. And then we had an interview with Wayne Lawrence, a man I genuinely take my hat off. There's about very few people I take my hat off to, but I'm going to take my hat off to Wayne Lawrence and his counselling in a prison environment. I have to say, I have so much admiration for Wayne because it's very, very easy to forget people. Very, very easy to forget people. And here's someone who isn't forgetting people. So, yes, that ends Practice Matters. And as always, as I say, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counsellor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counsellor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.